life, and it was there that his vocation to priesthood and eventually his vocation to found our congregation began to take shape. But he did more than hospital visitation. He also did what we would now call prison ministry. He visited people in prison. And as a young priest, he accompanied people on their way to execution and remained with them until they were executed, because the world then was in many ways rougher and more barbaric than it is now. And executions in Naples were public events. Huge crowds came. It was like a form of entertainment, and you can imagine how difficult that was for the condemned prisoner. But Alphonsus and others like him went with them to comfort and support them on their last journey. He did what we would now call youth ministry. He gathered the young people together, often on the street, to educate them in the faith, to teach them about Jesus, to teach them how to pray. And he also gathered groups of men in much the same way, gathered them together, first of all on the streets, and then in every place that became available to them. And he trained these men to take responsibility for their own Christian lives and to become leaders in their own communities. And he began giving parish missions. So all of this was going on in his life well before he founded the congregation. And he founded our congregation, as you know, to preach the gospel to the poor. He wanted us to go where nobody else would go, to work with those who lived on the edges and on the margins of society, and to work especially with those people who were being neglected by the church. Now, in the time of St. Alphonsus, they lived in the countryside, in the hills, in the mountains, in the valleys, far away from the towns and far away from the places where there were churches and schools. And an ongoing challenge to Redemptorists, of course, is to work out for ourselves in our own time who are the people with whom we should be working now, who are the abandoned, who are the marginalised, who are the people on the edges, who are the people with whom nobody wants to work. Because when St. Alphonsus founded the Redemptorists, he passed on to us his passion for Christ and his passion for the poor. We all know that as individuals we have a DNA, that we have a genetic structure. I think religious communities have something similar, a DNA, a genetic structure, and it's buried deep in the identity of the Redemptorists, buried deep in our congregational DNA, that we should be proclaiming the love of God, the good news of Jesus, and that we should be doing that especially to the abandoned poor, whoever they are and wherever they are to be found. The Redemptorists had begun to spread out of Italy by the time St. Alphonsus died. The first two non-Italian Redemptorists, St. Clement Hofbar and Thaddeus Hubel, had already gone to Warsaw to make a Redemptorist foundation. And St. Alphonsus, when he heard about this, he was old and sick at the time, he said they would have to do things differently there. Because he knew that they couldn't just repeat what he had been doing in the south of Italy. So how to do things differently, and how to hold on to the core values, to the core passions of St. Alphonsus. That's the challenge that always faces us as Redemptorists, not just as vowed Redemptorists, but as the wider Redemptorist community to which you also belong. So he knew before he died that the Redemptorists were beginning to spread out of Italy, and he knew that things would have to be done differently in different places. But I don't think he imagined the extent to which the congregation was going to spread, nor did he imagine either, I think, the very different ways in which Redemptorists would be faithful to his vision and to his passions. I've just come back from the Philippines. I've had the opportunity, the privilege for the past 2 months to teach a course about St. Alphonsus and about the Redemptorists to a group of young Redemptorists in Davao in the Philippines. We have an international house of studies there. There are Redemptorists there from the Philippines, from Vietnam, from Thailand, from Malaysia and from Singapore. And shortly they will be joined by young Redemptorists from Sri Lanka, and then next year young Redemptorists from Samoa are going to join them as well. And it was interesting for me to see how from different countries, different cultures, from the Philippines, where the overwhelming majority of the people are Catholic, from Thailand, where Catholics form a tiny minority in a Buddhist country, from Indonesia, where Catholics are a small minority in an Islamic country, from Vietnam, where in some ways the Church continues to be persecuted by the communist regime. It was interesting for me to see how these young Redemptorists have imbibed the passions of St. Alphonsus, how the love of Jesus and the love for the poor lives on in them and shapes their lives, and how dedicated they are to being Redemptorists and to continuing the work of St. Alphonsus and the vision of St. Alphonsus. When St. Alphonsus said that they would have to do things differently, I don't think he realized how differently things would be done by Redemptorists in some places of the world. In Indonesia, the Redemptorists run parishes, give missions, traditional Redemptorist work. They also run hostels for young people so that they can live in the towns and go to school. In Thailand, the Redemptorists work with the poorest of the poor. They work with prostitutes. They work with children who have been born with AIDS, because there's an AIDS crisis in Thailand. Western tourists go there. There's a sex industry, and the Redemptorists are picking up the pieces. And the works in Thailand, some of them are dedicated to the memory of Blessed Gennaro Sarnelli, who was one of the first Redemptorists, a friend and a companion of St. Alphonsus, and who, at the time of St. Alphonsus, worked with prostitutes in Naples and worked with street children. So that bit of our history lives again in Thailand. And in the Philippines and in Singapore, Redemptorists are especially associated, though they do much else as well, but they're especially associated with the devotion to Our Lady of Perpetual Help. In Manila, in Cebu, in Singapore, every week thousands and thousands and thousands of people join in celebrating the novena in honour of Our Lady of Perpetual Help. And one of the things that gave me some comfort, some consolation, when I was in Davao over the past few months, is that Redemptorist life in the Philippines came from Ireland. And what we planted there in 1906 is flourishing now. And it was from this monastery and from this church that Redemptorists went to the Philippines, and it was from here that they took the picture of Our Lady of Perpetual Help with them. And earlier they had taken that same picture of Our Lady of Perpetual Help to Australia. So from Ireland to the Philippines, from Ireland to Australia, and from Australia to Singapore, Redemptorists have taken copies of the icon of Our Lady of Perpetual Help, and the people have responded so enthusiastically to Mary, our Mother of Perpetual Help. So it's wonderful to see how the tradition is passed on, but how it takes different shapes in different places. So I ask you, as we celebrate our Eucharist and as we pray Our Lady's novena today, I ask you to pray for Redemptorists all over the world, that the passion for the poor and the passion for Christ will ever burn in our hearts. And I ask you especially to pray for the Redemptorist community in Davao, for those young men from so many different countries who, like Brian Nolan here, are preparing to become Redemptorist priests and Redemptorist missionaries.